Hello and welcome. It's time for a little Bible study. Today we are in Psalm 139, and this psalm, hopefully you've read it already, but you may recognize that it's one of the more popular psalms. If you're running around in Christian circles, it probably gets cited more than most, and that's partially because it's a really beautiful psalm, and we'll talk about that in our outline section. But if you want to grab the PDF before we start, you can download it on our website. There's a link down in the description. We are about 11 chapters away from the end. Let's talk about our author today. Our author is once again David, as was the case with Psalm 138. New Testament references, I thought for sure verses 7 through 10 were quoted somewhere in the New Testament, and I cannot find them. And so I have once again that we don't have any New Testament citations of Psalm 139. If I'm missing this and it's just completely I'm blind to it or something and somebody else can find it, please leave it down in the comment section, because I was like, I know this is quoted somewhere in the New Testament, but guess I'm wrong. I've been in the Psalms too long, evidently, and I'm starting to go crazy. Going down to our theme section, the first theme today is that God knows everything about all of us at every moment. And in light of that, David requests for God to deal with the wicked and bloodthirsty people on the earth. So we're going to see our chapter broken down into those themes pretty cleanly in our two sections today. Let's talk about definitions, though I want to define kind of a phrase, talk about just its meaning, and then we do have one word, which we've seen before. So the first one is to be hemmed in. What does it mean to be hemmed in? Sometimes this has a negative connotation, but I don't think that's the idea here. It's in verse 5. God hemmed David in, meaning that he surrounded him on every side and he had knowledge of everything that was going on around him. There also maybe a protective aspect to this, that nothing was able to get to David unless it went through God first. So God had hemmed him in. And then we have the term Sheol. We've talked about this. It usually refers to the place of the dead or the grave. Sometimes it can be used to refer to dark and unknown places, like places underground or places in the earth. So as I mentioned for our outline, we do have two sections. The first one's verses 1 through 18, and the second one is verses 19 through 24. Let's talk about section number 1. I've entitled it, God Knows Me Better Than I Know Myself. So Psalm 139 is a poetic description of God's intimate knowledge of every human being that he's ever created. Specifically, we're focused in here on David. David's writing about how God knows him better than he knows himself. Every one of David's actions was known by God. If he stood up, God knew. If he went to bed, God knew. God knew his daily habits, and he is acquainted with all of his ways, according to verse 3. And God even knew the words that were going to come out of David's mouth before David spoke them. And this isn't our application for today, but it would be wise for us to recognize the same thing. And I think our behavior would probably be very modified and very checked if we kept this on the top of our minds all the time. David went on to describe how God's knowledge of his creation was complete at every moment, and how his spirit was at all times in every place. No matter where David was, God knew his situation and could help him. No darkness could hide him. No distance could separate him from God. He talks about being in heaven. If he's in heaven, God is there. If he's in Sheol, in some unknown dark place, God is there. If he's in the remote parts of the sea, God is there. God knew everything about David even before David was fully formed, as his body was being intricately put together in his mother's womb. God still knew him. And he wrote this beautiful section of scripture, which I just want to read in its entirety. This is verses 13 through 16. Well, the second half of 13 through 16. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Talks about God having a book in which was written all the days of David, even before David had been fully formed in his mother, even before he had lived any of them. God knew about them. David sat back and admired the vast knowledge of God. His thoughts were innumerable, like sand, David writes, and too great for him to comprehend. This brings us to section number 2, verses 19 through 24. Deal with the wicked. Now, it can seem like there's a really big shift in tone here in David's language, and I think there is a big shift in tone, but it makes sense in light of the context. David's just been talking about how God knows everything. And so now he's gone from admiring all that God knows about him and how God has taken care of him to thinking, you know what, God, if you know everything, you know everyone's dealings and actions and thoughts, why don't you deal with the wicked people of the earth? And so that's what he calls on God to do here. In light of God's perfect knowledge and his omnipresence, meaning that he's everywhere, David shifts his tone and asks God to rid the world of evil people. And he's very serious about this request, and in the language here is very serious. He asked God to, quote, slay the wicked, the men of blood who hated the Lord's ways. And he talks about how these men were his enemies, they were the Lord's enemies, and how he hated them with, quote, complete hatred in verse 22. David concludes the psalm by asking God to protect him from becoming like those men. He asks the Lord to lead him in, quote, the way everlasting. It's interesting that he hates these evil-doing men, but at the same time he knows he needs God's help not to become like them. So that is our quick rundown of Psalm 139. Let's talk about our application now, and I want to pull it from verses 13 through 16. We can have all of the technical and scientific debates about when life starts, but those debates probably are not as important as simply understanding God's heart for babies as shared in Psalm 139, 13 through 16. God is at work inside of a mother, intricately knitting together new life. The text tells us that a baby's future days are already planned out by God, and a life story has already been written and put into a book by God, according to verse 16. And I think this is all the information that we need to conclude that God is not going to take it lightly when we rip up what he is knitting together and we tear up a book that he has already written.